Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Vedanta Center live stream this morning called Betrothed. This is an interesting lecture. It's taken a lot of different turns over the last week or so. At first, I was going to dive into the idea of betrothal as a practice of seeing God, as the hero that Ramakrishna talks about, God as lover. But interestingly enough, it sort of took different turns as I opened to some new ideas this week. In the process, I learned the difference between betrothal and engagement. I was just talking to the brothers about it 2 minutes ago, and it makes a big difference in the framing of what I thought would be fun to investigate this morning. The idea of a relationship with the beloved. I'm looking at, of course, God is the ultimate partner. Of course, God is that ultimate merging for each one of us. But our death is that betrothal. You see, an engagement is a statement of intention. It means we intend to get married. But a betrothal is a contract, and it usually comes with an absolute period that, yes, we are as good as married. We are no longer available for anything else. And of course, in my mind, a lot of ideas played with that. This idea that when you're betrothed, there's no other consideration. There's no other romantic interest, no other development of relationships, no longer scanning the horizon for that perfect partner. And I like to think of our relationship with the beloved in that way, in the way that we live our life, that we are on a spiritual quest for that unity with the divine. And that really there are no other options for us, that we're no longer considering ideas of the world. We're no longer considering other options for our life, other forms of enjoyment. But then I like the absolute idea of death, that this moment is coming. And of course, a lot of what brings that about is the death of Swami Yogeshananda yesterday, a longtime friend of many of ours at the Trabuco Center. Died, is he 97? 98 years old. So he had a wonderful run, was a delightful person, and certainly I enjoyed his friendship whenever I was there. And how absolute death is, how unmovable, unchangeable, that it is, in fact, the moment of the fruition of our betrothal, the date that the Lord has assigned for our absolute marriage, as it were. And so in thinking about death and thinking about betrothal and thinking about marriage and thinking about union, I've chosen a selection of poems, actually, written by monks and nuns, and one from the Old Testament, to kind of talk about different aspects of this approach to death, the idea of death, the idea of betrothal, the idea of marriage, and trying to lay out the beauty of it and the depth of it and the importance of it. This first poem, I was really struck by. It was sent by one of our friends in Michigan, actually, to me this week. And it's a delightful poem. It really captures the spiritual perspective of life in a beautiful way. And it's written by a Christian nun, Sister Carol Bielek. And I'm going to read the whole poem, and then I'll circle back and talk about different ideas within it. She says, I built my house by the sea, not on the sands, mind you, not on the shifting sand. And I built it of rock, a strong house by a strong sea. And we got well acquainted, the sea and I. Good neighbors, not that we spoke much. We met in silences, respectful, keeping our distance, but looking our thoughts across the fence of sand. Always the fence of sand our barrier, always the sand between. And then one day, and I still don't know how it happened, the sea came without warning, without welcome even, not sudden and swift, but a shifting across the sand like wine, less like the flow of water than the flow of blood, slow but coming, slow but flowing like an open wound. And I thought of flight, and I thought of drowning, and I thought of death. And while I thought, the sea crept higher till it reached my door. And I knew then there was neither flight, nor death, nor drowning, that when the sea comes calling, you stop being neighbors, well acquainted, friendly at a distance neighbors, and you give your house for a coral castle, and you learn to breathe underwater. This is that inevitable discussion of that relationship with our expiration, as it were. Not knowing that date, not knowing where it's stamped. That we talk of it. Occasionally we think about it. It's always at a distance, though. And she says that she built her house by the sea because we live in the constant shadow of this idea that all of this is going to go at some point. And we keep it kind of as a distant notion. But she makes a wonderful reference by making the distinction that she builds her house on the rock and of rock, and makes a point of saying not the sand, the shifting sand. And of course, being a Christian, she's referring to that great parable that Jesus says that the wise man builds his house on the rock, and when the storm rages and the winds blow and the rains pound, that the foolish man's house built on sand comes tumbling down. The wise man builds on the rock, and his house can withstand that onslaught. And it's clear from the Vedantic teachings what the meaning is in that this changing world, the shifting sand, where nothing is permanent, that the fool who builds his house here, who builds on the ideas of his pleasures, builds on the ideas of his wealth, builds on the ideas of his doings and his accomplishments, is doomed, because that wind will blow, the sea will come, and the house built on the changing world will fall. The rock, on the other hand, that Jesus says that we should build on is that unchanging self, that identity within you that is deep within you, that is always your most profound and deepest friend. That unchanging self that has been looking through your eyes all the days of your life. And I've been thinking about this quite a bit this week through the vlogs that we've been doing. This notion that within you there is a child, an eternal child, that's wedded really to the moment, the unchanging moment, the ever-present moment. That this moment and that unchanging self within are actually one and the same. And to build your life around the notions of that unchanging self that has watched this body go through all of its different changes, that has watched this body die actually many times over. Every cell in this body has been reproduced and has died through the length of our life. But within is that I, that ever-present I, that has been the same, that has been unchanged, and has experienced the swapping out of the body one cell at a time, and will experience that swapping out of the body when all the cells go at one time. And so to build on that sense of identity, to be strong in that sense of identity, when you look in the mirror, to look first through your eyes for the unchanging self, and that will help you to properly deal with the changing self that is ever changing in the mirror in front of you. So she says, I built on this rock, and I built my house of rock, and I got well acquainted with death. You know, Ramakrishna or Vivekananda says that one should think daily about death. He says, at first it's morbid, because at first we're built on the shifting sands. Our body is everything to us. Our gender is everything to us. Our abilities and work, ideas, dreams, hopes, aspirations, these are everything to us. But it's through that process of thinking of death, which is really the dropping off of the changing, that we begin to establish ourselves in that real self, in that self that peers out unchanged at all times, watching the mind, listening to the ears, watching through the eyes, smelling through the nose, and feeling through the body. that we constantly remember that this is all passing, so that we don't make the mistake of placing too much value on it, of anything more than a symbol of the divinity that is behind it. So respectfully we keep this relationship with death, keeping our distance, of course, looking at our thoughts across the fence of sand, always the fence of sand between us and the infinite, that changing world. As we look out, that we always have to look out and then look across. This is the important point that she's making. Looking across that changing world to the infinite, to the divine that lies just beyond it, just behind it. And to maintain that perspective in our life, that we're always looking through the changing at the infinite, at the beloved, at the divine, the mirror, the unchanging self. Always the fence of sand, our barrier, and always the sand between. And then one day, and I don't know how it happened, indeed, the day when the sea, when the infinite comes across the sand and meets us face to face, the day of our reckoning, the day when the body drops away. And she says that it's slow but coming. As we watch ourselves grow old, we watch our children grow old. And the interesting thing I find as I grow older is watching the people I know, the world that I know, slowly march off the end of the plank, as it were, one at a time. My grandparents went one at a time. And when I thought, each person that goes makes me one person closer in line for my own approach, my own jump from that end of the plank. And how it comes like slow and flowing like an open wound. A lot of pain, a lot of reckoning comes in those last days. I remember the call from my grandmother when she was passing away. And she called and talked to every single one of the relatives, apologized for anything that she might have said or done that was wrong, telling us how much that she loved us and what she saw in us and hoped for us, each one at a time before she passed. And how we see that reaction in the self, what's important really becomes more focused, more clear to us, to express our love, to express our kindness, our generosity, to share the important feelings that we have inside for everyone. And one of the benefits of becoming well acquainted with the ocean by being a kindly neighbor, by thinking of death every day, is that you don't lose those opportunities. You don't let those opportunities pass to share your love, to share your compassion, to give, to care, and to open the heart, so that when that final day comes, it's not a mad rush, like a sale at Walmart to try and get it all done, but that we have a slow and steady preparation where we live the life that we always wanted to live. And we remembered the things that are most important, the things that we will think of in those last moments, and to leave no regrets, but to leave our nature behind, as it were, in our acts of love, our words of love, our thoughts and best will for each other. And while I thought, the sea crept higher till it reached my door, and then I knew there was neither flight nor death nor drowning. If you are sitting aware and have made good friends with this unchanging self within, as the sea rises, as the body begins to decline, as you begin the process of dying, you're unafraid, because you know that you are that unchanging self, and that you have watched this body go through all of its changes. And this is just yet one more that you will observe as you grow and as you change and as you understand your infinite self. And that's what she says here. You make those adjustments little by little, letting go of a world that is going away anyway. We call it renunciation, but it's just good thinking. It's just reasonable. Renunciation comes to all of us. It's one of my favorite ideas, is that in the end, all of us are monks. All of us renounce. Not a single one of us will leave this world with anything that we love, anything that we're holding on to or grasping. So all of us are sannyasins in that sense, or sannyasins in waiting. And to make friends with this notion makes renunciation a natural progression. You naturally let go of the clothing that you outgrow. You naturally throw away the things that are broken, the things that are incomplete or no longer functioning for you. And renunciation, by living on that daily process of befriending the infinite, of knowing the unchanging self, it becomes more and more apparent that most of the material world is not so helpful with us, is not so helpful to us, is not so necessary. And we no longer get caught up in the anxieties, the fears, the depressions, and we let the things take their proper place at a distance as we watch the sea rise. But we live this life looking across that changing sea, a constant action, watching the waves break, watching our lives change, watching our friends and family change, watching the day to day as we go. This cycle of action that Vivekananda writes about in a lecture that he gave called Laws of Life and Death. And he says action can never die without producing action. Now, if our acts can only produce their appropriate effects on this plane of existence, it follows that we must all come back to round out the circle of causes and effects. That's the nature of this sandy world, this changing world. That every action has to have its cause, and it's a cycle, it's a circle. If you take responsibility for actions as the sense of agency, as the sense of the agent, the one who is the doer, then you must be there to respond and take on the results of that action, that you must accept the cause of it, and that it goes round and round, this circle of causes and effects. This is the doctrine of reincarnation, he says. We are slaves of law, the slaves of conduct, the slaves of thirst, the slaves of desire, the slaves of 1,000 things. Only by escaping from life can we escape from slavery to freedom. God is the only one who is free. God and freedom are one and the same. And what a beautiful reorientation that is, how that frames all of our renunciation from an act of suffering or an act of penance or an act of discipline and control to a new light, to a freedom, to a running, open and free. The ideas in my mind come to just of a huge open meadow where you're just free. No responsibility, no desire, no need, nothing lacking. That this is the fulfillment of the unity with the beloved, of finding that delightful freedom, that delightful oneness, and that betrothal, that inevitable betrothal, that guarantee that this union will come, that the date is set, that we are given to this, and we have not looked elsewhere for our freedom, for our love, for our fulfillment. Probably one of the most beautiful songs that I know, and one of the most famous ones, certainly from the scriptures, the Christian scriptures, is that Psalm of David, Psalm 23, that everyone knows. And yet I'm going to walk through it here because these are God's commitment to us in this term of betrothal, in this time that we are waiting for our date of union. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That's the first, to know that the beloved is the caretaker, that the beloved is love itself, and that all things that come your way with purpose, as a help, as a strength, as a teaching, guiding you and leading you through life, and to know that all of the events of your life are for your good and for your development. And when you suffer, when you can't see the love in what is happening, when you can't understand the compassion in the way that your life is, because it can get challenging, it can get extremely challenging. But as the one betrothed to the beloved, you work to find the trace of that love in everything that is going on around us, in every action, seeming action of the world, and to live our life with that kind of faith. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. I have no need. I want nothing more. I need nothing more. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He takes care of you. Now, when pure love, which is something we don't know, something that we're not familiar with in this earthly plane for sure, every love here has a price, has a requirement. It's that divine love that does not. And our lesson in life is to learn the nature of divine love and to return to that nature within ourselves. That's the nature of the unchanging self that we've talked about, that divine light within, that its nature is unconditioned love. So the Lord, walking and teaching, echoing that nature to us throughout our life, brings us into green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters and refreshes my soul. That this is that relationship with the beloved, that our practices are enjoying that communion with the divine. They're not quests, they're not searches for something, they're not trying to acquire or attain. They're spending moments laying in green fields beside quiet waters and enjoying the presence of the divine, that unchanging presence, that presence which is never far away. When we make the mistake of thinking that that the Lord has left us, we talk in terms of that. You see that mentioned in many times. That is one perspective. It's a way of looking at the thing. But really what's going on when it seems that the Lord has left you, you've stopped looking at him or her or that. You've put your attention elsewhere because it is impossible for the Lord to leave you. Your existence is the divine. Your intelligence is the divine. Your love, your ability to love and to receive love is the divine. We can know those never leave us. They are always present, and they are the things that we should always keep our attention on. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Now, this one to me was very beautiful. I used to think that to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I used to think that that meant like when my life gets really hard or when things get really challenging. But it is life itself. We are living in the shadow of death, always. That our life, this valley, there's no escape from that. And so it's an assurance that we will fear no evil, we'll fear no wrongdoing. We will be fearless in our essence as we live our life. It's really a challenge in a way to hold on to that faith based on what he just told us, that the Lord is the shepherd, that he leads you to green pastures, that he leads you beside still waters, that all things are working together for good for you because of that relationship and because of the nature of your own being. To build in that faith and to stand on that faith and to find an amazing amount of strength in that faith as you walk through this valley in the shadow of death, as you spend this life. I will fear no evil. That's your proclamation to the beloved. For you are with me. That's where we find that strength. That's where we find that ability to not be afraid, to not give up, to not be worn down, to not become tired, to resist the world's constant onslaught of trying to turn us into an automaton who just reacts mechanically to everything, where life loses its luster, where the wonder of existence is no longer a wonder, where being loses its light. If the walk with the divine, with the presence, with the constant thought of this death, the ending of this ever-changing, sifting, insecure world, and planting our seed only in the unchanging, our identity only in the unchanging. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. What is a rod and your staff? The rod and staff is what the shepherd uses, to poke at the sheep to get them to go in the direction. Well, if you're a sheep and you're getting poked with the rod or hit with the staff, yeah, it's not a pleasant thing, right? And when life gives you those blows, it's not a pleasant thing. It's not fun to lose your friends. It's not fun to lose jobs. It's not fun to lose health. It's not fun when any of these changing things are taken out of our hands before we were willing to let go of them. But he says here, David makes the commitment, I will find comfort in those blows. I will find comfort in the difficult things that happen. Why? Because they're done through love, by love, for love, as an expression of love. And our effort in our practice is constantly to find that place within where we can stand and see the love in everything that is happening. That's what happens at the moment of realization. You find that perspective where the presence of the beloved is everywhere, without exception. There is no evil left in that world. There is no suffering left in that world. There may be pain. There may be pokes from the rod and the staff every now and then to keep us on the path or to teach us that lesson, but there's never suffering. Suffering happens only when you're attached and when you stop believing that all things are working together for your good. When you stop knowing the unchanging self within is unchanged by the world. It doesn't get burned. It doesn't get wet. It's ever present and ever strong. And here he says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup, it overflows. Surely your goodness, your love will follow me all the days of my life. And I will dwell in the house of my beloved forever. That this is the meeting of that betrothal. So you see, walk is included here, and that constant pointing to faith in that walk, and that constant remembrance of that divine nature within us, and the commitment by his very nature and by his very being of the beloved, who has married himself to us with an impossibility of separation, that he cannot leave you. If God leaves you for even the split of a second, you cease to exist, you cease to think, you cease to be aware. So it's always good to remember when you're feeling the most alone, the fact that you're feeling anything is the presence of your beloved, the presence of your divine nature. And within that is an infinite hope that should never be forgotten, should never be left behind. It's the one companion, the only companion, that will be there on the day of your betrothal, the day when the date comes for that meeting, for that union to come to light. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the beloved forever. This is the promise, and it's the divine commitment to you in this life and in the process of living this life, to know that you have something that you can always hold on to, that you can always find strength in, that you can always find a reason to get up and to keep going. Now, when the psalmist brings us to that point of spending all the days of our life and beyond in the house of the Lord, the presence, that moment of death is always a fascinating one, to when that life goes from the body, that mystery of what has happened, what has been there. How can something that was so beautiful and so wonderful, like a body, suddenly in literally a single moment becoming something repulsive, something you don't even want to touch or be near? What is that magic that happens, and what is there that we can possibly learn from that moment? There's a wonderful book that I found this week called Death Poems of Zen monks. And there was a tradition, a long-term tradition, starting around the 1100s or so, where Zen monks would write a haiku as their last act before they died. And the book gives the impression that many of these monks wrote the poem, said it out loud, and died. That the ideal in Zen Buddhism is to die either sitting in meditation posture or standing. So death almost becomes an act of will. But I found this book of these poems, and I was just, each one of them, for some reason, when you think about someone's point of death, their last words carry such an importance to us, which I find fascinating, that all of our life we just spew. We talk and talk and talk and talk, and we just don't pay any attention to most of it, and it just comes and goes. But those last things that you say, those last words, those are remembered, those are written down, those are treasured, because there's some assumption that there will be wisdom there, that there will be knowledge there, that there will be a summary or some light there. So here we have, I collected about 4 or 5 of these poems. They're very short, they're haikus, and I want to share them and talk about each one of them. This first one is by Dairin Soto. He died on the 27th day of the first month of 1568. So the 27th of January, 1568, at the age of 89. He says, "My whole life I've sharpened my sword, and now face to face with death, I unsheath it, and lo, the blade is broken. Alas." That one I sat with for a long time. There was so many things in it. You know, we spend our entire life, and it makes the point that this moment of death can't ever really be prepared for, that there's a profundity to it that the mind is not going to be able to grasp. There's an experience of it that the mind is not going to be able to understand or to know how to process this, because it's the end of those things. It's the end of the doer. It's the end of the impure mind. So he says he spends his whole life polishing that sword, polishing, polishing, polishing. And at the end, when he draws it, lo, the sword is broken. There is no preparation for that. You see, this world is unreal. This world is not the important part of that experience. This world, by its nature, is broken. The world of change is constantly changing because of the idea of imbalance, of imperfection, of ignorance. And so no sword crafted in this world can take you beyond the edge of that moment. Any sword that can be polished in this life will be broken at the moment of death. You go as you are, with what you are, and nothing else but the company of your beloved, the unchanging nature that has always been with you, but now is all that you have, is all that you possess. Gizan Senrai, of course I'm probably brutally massacring these names. Gizan Senrai, he died on the 28th day of March, 1878, so much more modern, at the age of 77. You know, I looked at these ages, and most of them are pretty old. There is 1 or 2 in here that's rather young. But in thinking of death, which I have made it part of my practice, I was quite stunned. You know, I had a birthday in January, and I talk about this all the time because it is on my mind all the time, hopefully in a healthy way. But this notion that I'm only 14 years from 70. And when I, you know, if I just say 56, I'm like, everybody that I live with will say, "Oh, you're still a baby." That's the advantage of living in a monastery with old men. Is that you're always young. There's always 2 or 3 folks that are going to be older than you. And so here I am, 56, always the baby, but laying there thinking about being 56 and counting and realizing, God, I'm 14 years from 70. Now, 70 to me is old. I apologize to everybody out there over 70. You know, that number has changed as you grow older. That number keeps increasing, right? When you're in your 20s, 30 is like, what? That's so old. 35, forget it. You never think beyond 35. As a matter of fact, I realized when I was a young man, the year 2000, I had calculated when I was 7 and living in Utah. I was outside playing in the yard, and for some reason, I calculated that at the year 2000, which at that point was like this huge boundary, like the millennium, to the change of the millennium, I was going to be 35 years old. I couldn't even imagine. I thought, God, 35. Wow, 35. But the odd thing is that in all the years approaching that, I never thought 1 year beyond it. I always thought 35, boom, that's where it was. And that's the nature of forgetfulness. That's the nature of the changing worlds. It gets us all caught up in all of these flashing, glittering, changing things. And we never realize our infinite nature. We never settle upon our eternity. We never recognize that in this moment, that eternity is our closest companion. We forget. And age goes on and on and on and on. So here I am now, 14 years, significantly beyond the year 2000 now, incidentally, and 14 years from 70. And I began to think, wow, I've only been in the monastery 21 years, which I have to tell you feels like 2 days. It feels like I just joined. Those memories are so fresh and the whole experience so new to me, even still, that the thought of that I have less time than that between me and 70 is a wonderful invitation to grow up. It's a wonderful invitation to be prepared. I always tell this story about Swami Asitananda, who was an old monk when I met him. And as through my years in San Francisco, I watched him grow old to the point where he couldn't leave his chair. And I tell this story all the time because it's a fundamental part of my life and my experience, to know that when he could no longer get out of a chair, his whole world was the size of a single chair in a single room. And it was at the Olima retreat, which is in the middle of nowhere, 2,300 acres of forest land. He had no visitors, very few friends coming to visit. It wasn't a place that devotees would drop into 2 or 3 times a day to say hi. He would sit alone in that chair 24 hours a day. He would sleep in the same chair, just recline it, and during the day it would sit up. And I, being the brahmachari at the time, would check in on him every now and then. And it was always a marvelous puzzle to me and a part of my delight that every time I looked in on him, he was smiling. That every time I looked in on him, he had this sort of distant glance in his eyes of just contentedness, bliss. And the last time that I saw him was in the old folks' home in San Rafael. And it was such an odd assignment that I had. Everybody knew that his days were close to an end, and we didn't have a picture of him. We knew we didn't have a picture that we were going to be able to send as an obituary to the headquarters when he died. And so I was given the task of going and taking that picture of Swami Asitananda. And I remember walking in, and of course, old folks' homes are never a pretty place to go, especially when you're a younger man. And I went in there, and of course, that odd scent in the air, and the sort of ammonia background that's there, and the industrial or institutional nature of the place. I walked in, everybody sitting in their chairs, everybody going on their business, and I asked for Swami Asitananda, and they said, "Oh, he's down the hall." So I went around this corner, and this long hall, as all long halls are in institutions, tile floors and flickering fluorescence. He's sitting at the end of this hall facing a closed door in a wheelchair. And he's just sitting there facing this closed door. And I walk down the hall. He's unmoving. He's just sitting there facing a closed door. And I'm thinking, this is so odd. And on this door was a big red stop sign. It just said, "Stop. This door is alarmed. Do not go through it." So he's sitting there. I walk up to him. I greet him. "Hello, Maharaj." "Hello." I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I was wheeling myself down the hall here, and I got here and I looked up and this big sign said stop. So I stopped, and I've just been sitting here." And I thought, what an odd thing that was. Anyway, I brought him a chutter to kind of cover up his whatever he was wearing to take his picture. And I remember the stress inside because I didn't want him to know why I was taking the picture. I didn't want that to be part of it, but I knew that he knew, and he smiled about it. And he's like, "Oh yes, we must take care of these things." And so he sat up. I put the chutter around him. I snapped the picture, and he took the chutter off and handed it back to me and sat there. And I left. And I turned around just before I left and saw him standing at the door, not standing, sitting in the wheelchair at the door with the stop sign on it, having taken his picture for the obituary. And that is death. That is what happens in life. We come to the end of the hall. There's no going farther. This is the end of the changing world for you. And if you haven't done the work that Swami Asitananda had done to be able to find the bliss within, that sort of tongue-in-cheek mischief of the divine that I find so infinitely intriguing, that fun, that he could sit there and see the joke of it all, that he could transcend the morbidity, transcend the depressive nature of it if you are a man or a woman attached to the changing world, that he could detach from that and see the humor in all of it and be unbothered. And be unbothered. Gizon Zenrai died at 77 and writes, "I was born into this world. I leave it at my death. Into 1,000 towns my legs have carried me, and countless homes. What are all of these? A moon reflected in the water, a flower floating in the sky. Ho," is how he ends. It says here as a note to that poem, it says, "Ho" is a translation of the word totsu or katsu, a kind of challenging cry uttered at the moment of enlightenment, the moment of understanding. So he says, "I was born into this world and I will leave it at my death." The two ends of the rope right there. One, an existence, and then the non-existence in that world. And you add one, you take one. You're left with nothing. And he says, that life was full. As a wandering monk, he walked through 1,000 towns and went into countless homes. And now he says, what? What did all of it add to? I was added at birth. I'm taken away at death. The sum is zero. And what does he describe it to? He says, a moon reflected in the water. There was no reality there. It was a reflection of something deeper, something more profound. That the thing was not the doing and the traveling and the experiencing. It was a reflection of the beautiful. It was a reflection of the immortal. It was a reflection of love. And he understood that it was not the beauty itself, that it was not the thing itself, and there is no sadness in leaving it, because it was only the reflection of the moon on the water. And now you can see the moon, a flower floating in the sky. Just that basis. It was an idea. It was an imagination. But the beauty of that is that there's no nihilism here. He understood the beautiful nature of it. Both of his images of what this was all about was beautiful. This was a reflection of the moon and the water, one of the most beautiful things we see, a flower suspended in the sky. Just a delightful imagery of the unreal, of the effervescent. There's nothing more temporary than a flower. We pick them for the shrine every morning, and by the end of the day, they're ready to be tossed out. And very few things quite as beautiful and as delicate as a flower. My Aunt Elsie, she taught me to look at flowers. I remember being 7 years old and taking a walk with her, with my family actually, and she was visiting. And she calls me over. Now I'm 7, and she calls me over, and there's this bush, and it has these thousands of little tiny white flowers. They were tiny, like each one of them was probably like 2 or 3 millimeters in size. And she makes me bend down and she says, look at that. And I looked at it. And of course, at first I look at it as a 7-year-old kid. I'm like, yes, so what? 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 And she says, look at it. Look how delicate it is. So I look and I see how delicate it is. She says, look at the stamens, how tiny they are, each one of them. And then she goes on and she says, do you see how God is? How nothing is too small for his attention. There is nothing he can't express beauty in. And that was my Aunt Elsie. That was my Aunt Elsie. She taught me to see flowers. And here this monk is saying, what is in all of this life? It's a flower suspended in the sky. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. And it's been delightful. And it should be a delightful thing. And it should be a beautiful thing. And you should know that it's a beautiful thing. But then you should know that it's a reflection in the water, that it isn't the real thing, that now you will see the real thing. Ho. Ingo. Now, he is quite some time ago. He died in August 21st of 1281, quite some time ago, at the age of 72. 73 years. All right, he says he died at 73. The book said 72. 73 years I've drawn pure water from the fire. Now I become a tiny bug. With a touch of my body, I shatter all the worlds. Now, I ended this one because it's the one that I don't understand. It's the one that I can't really expound on in a way that makes perfect sense to me. I love the fact he says, I've drawn pure water from the fire. You see, the nature of this world is fire, right? It's fire and light, which gives everything its existence. That sort of, it's the creative aspect of it all. That, you know, without the sun, there would be no life on this planet. There would be no growth. There would be nothing living. It would be barren. So all of this world is, in fact, the product of fire, coming out of fire. And from that, he says, I have drawn the pure water. I have found the antithesis of that creation, that change, you know, that I have found the thing that snuffs it back to its source, back to its origin. And I'm becoming a tiny bug. I imagine that at that last moment, the body loses all of its power. You lose all of your effect in the world, all of your authority, all of your power. Exactly. I mean, if you were a man of authority or a woman of authority, you now have none. You know, and again, I'm reminded. My friend Bill was working with a woman who was a socialite, millions and millions of dollars, homes in many cities around the world. And in the last days, when Bill was taking care of her, she, like Swami Asitananda, was relegated to a single bed. So here was a woman owning multiple homes in multiple beautiful places around the world. What were they to her at that moment? They were nothing. They were unusable. They were beyond reach. And he used to talk about how her family would be in the other room. And he could hear them arguing about how things were going to be divided and what needed to be done and what stock should be kept. And he said that they were scheming up until the last moment, just in the other room where this woman was passing away in her bed. And I think that this monk is drawing an allusion to that, saying, look, I've become a tiny bug. My influence on the world is nothing. And yet in that, he says, with a touch of my body. Now, does he mean his dying body or his sense of self? I shatter all the worlds. That all of this existence depended on his existence with the body and mind, with senses to watch it, to observe it, to see it, to be aware of it. And now, with just a touch, it's shattered. It's gone. All of this immensity, all of this import, all of this grand theater, gone, shattered. And we're brought back to the first poem. Where have you built your house? Where have you lived? What have you thought was important? What have you invested in? What are you thinking about? What do you love? And in that last moment, will it be enough? Will it survive this shattering of disappearance? You're betrothed to the Lord, to that infinite divine, to the endless ocean. You're betrothed. Are you still looking elsewhere for a companion? You're betrothed. Are you still loving other things? Are you still holding out for a better deal? You're betrothed to the Lord.